I hadn't appreciated that bio was so long when I sent it in. Sorry about that. So I don't often disagree rather, with Julian on anything, but I just wanted to say one word in defence of hydrogen before I get on to my presentation, and that is, it does have its drawbacks at the moment, but it is quicker to refuel, and it always will be. You can go further at the moment. You can generate it and store it at times when power is more plentiful. And in a world where we're told we're going to have a decarbonised energy grid by 2040, cheap, almost free power, we have to think about that. And in a world where we might have hydrogen for heating our homes flowing through our pipes, it might be quite a handy thing to draw off some of that from our pipe network to refuelling hubs. So let's not discount hydrogen completely for the heavier transport uses. So back to my presentation now. I appreciate that in the main, I'm probably preaching to the converted today, certainly from what I've heard so far. But I want to use the first part of my session to talk about modal shift, and the second part to look at a particular use case in a bit more detail. So what is this transport decarbonisation thing all about? Well, someone of significance last year said it's not about stopping people doing things, it's about doing the same things differently. To me, at least, that seems to say, well, if you drive a car at the moment, even if you don't really have to, you can keep doing that, but that car's got to be low or zero emissions, at least after 2030. I don't know, is that a fair interpretation? I think it's worth unpicking that a little bit in the context of the North. So I've taken this graph from our decarbonisation strategy at TFM, and what it shows are a number of future emission baseline trajectories, starting from our current baseline year of 2018 for surface transport emissions in the North. And those future emission baselines are represented by the coloured lines, and all of them have current government decarbonisation policy targets baked into them. But on top of that, they represent 4 plausible futures in terms of the ways we'll be travelling and the drivers of travel demand. And the scenario which we've named just about managing, that's the dark purple one, rather depressingly, that sort of represents where we are, our business as usual, with a relatively gradual shift in lifestyles and travel, where we don't alter our behaviours quickly, and any changes are really driven just by market forces. Prioritised places in pink sees a shift of focus towards people and place, work-life balance, more local investment in economic and social infrastructure. We might see more people living in smaller towns, rural areas, and hence a slower growth of our main cities. Our third scenario, digitally distributed in bright blue, that sees people being less tied to where they work, with increased digital remote working, dispersed employment. Sound familiar? But whilst we see people commuting less often, the trips they're making are often longer as a consequence of where they're now living. And their car dependency, the crucial car dependency and car ownership remains high. So we really see a poor emissions performance. This is where we are. We're going to see a poor emissions performance in the short term. But we do see a willingness to embrace technological change, that high and rapid uptake of zero-emission vehicles, we're seeing that, and autonomous vehicles, which sees this scenario seeing a much more rapid emissions reduction post-2030. And finally, we have urban zero carbon in a nice environmental green, and that sees growth mainly in cities and a fundamental refocus by both the public and government towards action on climate change. And that allows a much quicker step change in those emissions reductions. And it's really quite an optimistic scenario. And the black dotted line is our decarbonisation trajectory. So that's where we need to get to. That's been agreed with our partners, the 20 local authorities across the North, our LEPs. And it's slightly more ambitious than a CCC balanced pathway aligned trajectory. And you'll actually see that pretty much all our future baselines do actually reach close to zero by 2050. But of course, it's what they do between now and then which is important. And you'll see that all of them, even the most optimistic, urban zero carbon, they run above our trajectory for most of the time. And that's important because what that means is that every year, starting from 2018, under all our future scenarios, we're busting our yearly carbon budget for surface transport in the north. And in fact, that means we bust our total budget by 2030. And what happens in 2030? Yeah, it's the government's phase-out date for the sale of internal combustion engine cars and vehicles. But it's too late. We've used all the carbon up. And that's without considering that those internal combustion engine cars and vehicles, a lot of them will still be on the road for decades after that point, and that our grid electricity still won't be fully decarbonised. This table shows the level of policy commitment that we've calculated is going to be needed to hit our decarbonisation ambitions in the north, and we've called these our pathways. And the first most important box to draw your attention to, again in environmental green, it's the crucial part of the pathway in the near term up to 2030. We need to reduce the miles travelled by private car by up to 14% by 2030. And it's in this row of the table, of course, where rail can play the biggest part, reducing those car miles through modal shift. And the second most important box is the blue one. But before looking at that, if I can draw your eyes up to the third row of the table, we've assumed some pretty optimistic zero-emission HGV sales assumptions. And they're going to be difficult to achieve, particularly in the short term. So those HGV road mileage reductions in the blue box become even more important. And we might actually need to raise them. And clearly, in a world where consumption continues to grow and the demands on our freight network continue to grow, we're going to need to shift road freight to rail, and that's going to be key, absolutely key, alongside road freight efficiency measures. So I guess my point is, if we don't want to blow our budget to smithereens before we can get to zero-emission vehicles doing that heavy lifting, then we have to reduce that road vehicle mileage significantly in the short term. So we know that modal shift is essential from a decarbonisation point of view. But what about the much-touted fair or just transition? And I firstly want to talk a little about transport-related social exclusion. I'm going to call that TRSE because it's a bit of a tongue twister. TFN is in the middle of a programme of research characterising the nature and the causes of TRSE in the north. And from this, we know that the most common characteristic of those suffering from TRSE are those who have little or no access to private cars for accessing key services. We also know that TRSE is particularly acute for those on low incomes, for those with disabilities and long-term health conditions, those with caring responsibilities who are predominantly women, as well as the young and the elderly within our communities. And another thing we know is that there's a direct link from the increasing exclusion of those groups to the gradual but constant decline of our bus services serving our communities. So how do we address the fair transition? Well, what is a fair transition? This is my definition, not necessarily TFN's, but it's a transition where everyone has access to goods and services, those essential ones, education, health, and jobs, where no one is disproportionately affected by the negative externalities of transport, i.e. air pollution, accidents, noise pollution. And crucially, where no one has the right to disproportionately consume a higher share of the remaining carbon budget. And this graph is taken from a piece of work by Noel Cass and Karen Lucas, sponsored by the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, based at the University of Oxford. It's called CREDS. And the graph shows the energy footprint of different household income groups. And you can clearly see there's a fairly linear correlation between wealth and emissions. And perhaps the most striking bit of this graph is how the transport bits really expand. Yeah, so those are the lightest purple bits in the middle of the bars. So what this shows us is that the lowest income groups not only suffer the worst levels of TRSE, but also have the lowest carbon footprints. So a transition to a fairer transport system is inherently linked with a transition to a lower carbon society. Of course, the crucial thing is that TRSE isn't addressed by providing those suffering with it with high carbon modal choices. And that is why modal shift and increasing the convenience and decreasing the relative cost of public transport is the fairest pathway of any. So I guess this is what I think someone of significance should have said. It's not about stopping people going places. It's about doing different things to access those same places. This isn't a presentation of a critique of government policy. In fact, in an international context, we're fairly progressive, and it's absolutely right that we've moved on from that really negative portrayal of climate change to some more positive discourse around the opportunities stemming from decarbonisation and clean growth. But that discourse needs to be grounded in climate change science. However amazing new zero or low carbon technologies or materials are, and however fast they come about, we have to accept that it's inevitable that a lot of people are still going to have to do different things to get to the same places. The thing is, it does require change on a personal level, and I think we have to be honest about that. For many, myself included, that contemplation of change is really difficult. And most of the major changes in our behaviour have actually been driven by technology, not human choice. The rise of the internet, the rise of the smartphone, the rise of the virtual meetings more recently. So that's where technology has provided us with one or both of what I call the two big C's. And I'm not talking about COVID, I'm talking about cost and convenience. But with modal shift, we're seemingly asking people to change their travel choices, even though, in many cases, the convenience and cost of doing so doesn't stack up. So just a word on one of the two big C's. Firstly, convenience. I think the majority of people in this room could probably talk much better as to how you improve our railway system to increase its convenience. So I just want to say something briefly about the other big C, cost. And I'm afraid I don't buy this war on motorists mantra. Motorists have been driving around for years, costing wider society much more than what they contribute through fuel taxes and vehicle duty. But perhaps more to the point, in this country, the relative cost of taking the train, or in this part of the world, in the northwest at least, even a bus. And that it just doesn't stack up against the cost of running a car for those same journeys. And I was struck by Abisola's slide on rail fares for the 100 and 150 miles in the UK compared to other places in Europe. It's 9 or 10 times the price, 3 or 4 times more than France. But perhaps, well, how can it ever be right? How can it ever be right that it costs more to make the same journey by taking a standard class seat in a train than being a lone driver in a car? And the Transport Select Committee on Road Pricing recently released this report, and I took 3 takeaways from it. And again, these are my views, not necessarily TFN's. But firstly, there was an agreement that the looming gap from a drop in fuel duties due to EV uptake needs to be plugged through a different system of road pricing. Agreed. Secondly, there was no acknowledgement of the wider negative externalities associated with high car use. Thirdly, the report emphasised that whatever pricing was brought in, it needed to be the same or lower than current levels for motorists. Well, I'm afraid that if we're going to get people out of their cars and onto trains and buses, we need to more accurately reflect the relative costs to the economy and wider society of different travel choices within the pricing for using those modes. Relatively speaking, that would mean that taking a train would nearly always be cheaper than driving a car on your own, and that taking a bus would be cheaper still. And in theory, the government could almost be paying you to cycle. But of course, there are always caveats. There are those that need to use road vehicles because of the type of work they do or when they need to travel. And any pricing system will need to be dynamic enough to reflect that. And the other big caveat is that you need to provide people with a choice. And that's really where major investment in our existing and new public and active travel infrastructure and systems is needed. Okay, enough of the serious stuff. Time for some more graphs. There's loads you can talk about rail and decarbonisation, but I just want to sort of, again, unpack it a little bit. The graph on the top left here, many people will have seen. It's DEFRA's old GHG greenhouse gas conversion factors. And what it shows is CO2 emissions per passenger kilometre. And we can see the second bar down is intercity train. And it's about a quarter of what it is if you drove a medium-sized car on your own. So rail travel is already one of the least carbon-intensive ways to travel. And the other graph is taken from our decarbonisation strategy. So this is for the north. And we can see that rail accounts for less than 3% of our surface transport emissions. And that's reflected at a national level too. And actually in the north, over 95% of our emissions occur from journeys on our roads. And I haven't included buses or coaches in that. And this graph is taken from National Travel Survey data analysed by the Decarbonate group. And it shows that a third of all miles travelled by all modes, but not freight, are on journeys of over 50 miles in length. And that third of miles comes from less than 2% of our trips. Now, the percentage of miles doesn't exactly equate to the percentage of emissions, but it's not a bad proxy. So essentially what this graph tells us is that a really significant part of our emissions from surface transport come from very few trips, but they're the longest trips. And this graph, again, from National Travel Survey data analysed by the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds, shows us that of those third of all miles incurred on trips of over 50 miles in length, over 60% of them are accounted for through leisure travel. So what does that tell us about the opportunities for rail to help us decarbonise? Firstly, the biggest gains by far, so this is controversial this bit, the biggest gains by far in terms of carbon emissions will come from modal shift to rail rather than decarbonising rail traction. And that's really important when we look at opportunity costs. Secondly, in terms of modal shift to rail, substituting longer distance trips, 50 miles or over, from road to rail represents one of the biggest decarbonisation opportunities, and tackling the leisure market is key in that. In terms of rail, we know that pre-pandemic, over half of all trips by rail on a whole of UK basis were for commuting or business purposes. But actually, how has that profile now changed in light of COVID? Again, I'm sure there's many in the room who will know much better than me. But if we are seeing a stronger leisure and weekend market comparatively, what opportunities does that present for decarbonisation? And how do we take advantage of them? Could a 7-day-a-week railway with smoothed commuting peaks be as viable or even more viable to previous systems focused on commuter need? And actually, a key finding that fell out of our TRSE work were that the number of groups suffering time-based exclusion from public transport, i.e. those who need to travel outside of peak periods, but when public transport provision drops away, the elderly, the young, but particularly those with caring and household responsibilities, and those on low incomes working shift patterns, irregular working hours. So a less peaky railway network starts to help address time-based exclusion too. And how could we employ our passenger trains to fulfil express logistics requirements, delivering parcels by rail, using excess capacity on our passenger services? But there are some big hurdles to decarbonising the leisure journey. And I think if we bring it back again into the northern context and look at some of the findings of TfN's visitor economy research from last year, we found that 87% of visitors to the Lake District National Park arrive by car. Again, that's mirrored across the UK with our national parks. Visitors expunge more than 500,000 tonnes of CO2 travelling to and around the park, compared to just 165,000 tonnes from those living in the park. And we also found that the biggest segment of rail journey purpose in the north is actually for leisure, but that a higher proportion of intra-regional visitor trips are made by car in the north compared to other parts of England. So we know that our rail network in the north is probably better serving those visitors who are travelling into and out of the north, as opposed to those leisure seekers who want to travel within the north. And we can probably also surmise that there's an untapped opportunity to convert even more of those intra-regional leisure trips to rail. And my second point on this slide isn't regionally specific, but it's about the importance of the first and last mile. And I think the first and last mile for leisure is a subject that needs further examination. What are the different requirements for those first and last miles for leisure? Is there a need for more baggage room and catering for oversized baggage? Do people want to bring their pets, their dogs? Might those last miles last several miles? Might they be more remote? And caught up with all of this is behaviour change. Will it be just enough to provide modal integration? And that comes back to the psychology of leisure travel, and plaudits to Gillian Annabel in the Institute of Transport Studies at the University of Leeds for this bit of thinking, which I think is particularly focused on day trips and the sort of intra-regional trips, which we know in the north at least are made predominantly by car. And this thinking is split into what in reality happens at the moment and the sort of shift in behaviour that we need to get to. So what tends to happen is that people think, well, let's go out somewhere this weekend. And there's an underlying assumption that that means by car. It's only then that the destination is chosen, and actually it doesn't matter because they were going to go by car anyway. Whereas what we need people to do is think, where do you want to go, with no underlying assumption of how they're going to get there, and then plan their journey once they know their destination. It might still be by car, but that decision has to be taken in the light of a fuller understanding of the different choices and the benefits and costs of those choices. It's not rocket science, and it's actually a really subtle difference, but actually changing that deeply ingrained underlying assumption of car use is really difficult. And again, it comes back to the need to address those two big C's, cost and convenience, for alternative modes relative to car travel, and of course, communicating those. So my final slide. When it comes to leisure travel, what sort of things can we do to start increasing the convenience of making those trips by rail? Well, we could start by reducing Sunday and bank holiday closures on rail lines to visitor hotspots. We could start thinking, do we need to alter carriage layouts with comfort being a greater priority, catering for families and larger groups? Do we need as much first class? There's a really interesting section within that book, How Bad Are Bananas? Sitting in a first class train seat in a half-full first class carriage is pretty bad in carbon content. Should we be creating iconic gateway stations to these incredible natural and cultural resources we have? Obviously, we need to increase capacity on existing rail lines in these areas and improve their connectivity with mainline services. But what about the ticketing deals? We need to include onward travel. We really need to be working with tour companies to develop products, integrated marketing and mobile ticketing, and products that cater to specific user groups, such as younger adults from cities or day trip ramblers. And I think a really decent example of this is from Europe in the Alpine Pearls. And essentially, it's a company that arranges car-free holidays linked to actual activities and accommodation in rural locations across 19 really rural villages in the Alps. So I urge you to look that up if you're planning a trip to Europe this year. And we have to combine all that good stuff, which really falls into that increasing convenience bracket, with those that start addressing the relative cost and convenience of different travel choices. So the dreaded demand management measures. For example, can we restrict visitor access to busy areas at busy times and ring-fence revenues better from car use for the provision of that more integrated visitor access? So I'll just end on some examples of last-mile solutions from rural areas in the north. And the first one, the driverless pod there, is from the Lake District, where a trial ended in May last year. And the idea was that these pods could be booked and pick you up from the station and take you to your hotel, or in the future even to the start of your walking route, wherever, really. And the key thing is that they can be shared by multiple passengers, they can operate on demand via an app on the go, and they've got the potential to connect up with other pods to work in a virtual train to minimise congestion. Now, in the Derwent Valley Car Club, that's a community transport scheme that includes electric bikes. And the exciting thing about electric bikes is that from a leisure perspective, they make the cycling experience more accessible to a wider range of people. But from a resident's perspective, they make cycling greater distances and more challenging topographies a more reasonable proposition. So actually, I think e-bikes, for people who don't have access to a car or who just don't want to use them, they could be really key to increasing accessibility in those sort of areas. And of course, there'll still be people who need a private car for what they want to do, but we should be thinking about how we take away the need to use that car for that long journey into that area, the trip that emits all of that carbon. So going back to the Lake District and the co-wheel scheme, you can actually book a car or van from one of 3 train stations and you can access it via a pay-as-you-go system. Some of their cars and vans are EVs as well. But from a congestion perspective, you're not bringing additional vehicles into the area. Tick. From a decarbonisation perspective, you're cutting out that longer journey. But also we know that car clubs generally have higher occupancy and lower emissions than most private vehicles. Of course, that's even better if it's an EV. So I'll finish my ramble there, and I really look forward to some questions and discussion. Thank you.